go ahead. We'll get started. Rob is a firefighter. He is here with his nonprofit foundation called Skulls for Hope. And I will turn the time over to you now, sir.
Yeah, so I'm a paramedic lieutenant with the local fire department. I founded Skulls for Hope, gosh, probably about 6 or 7 years ago now. And I'm the treatment director for a national nonprofit called Next Rung. And kind of the idea behind all of it, including SCION, which is nice, is that we're trying to start a conversation. We're trying to let people know, and it's all cliche, I know, but it's that it's okay to not be okay, that you're not alone, things like that, because a lot of times when we're in crisis, we're the last ones to reach out for help, and we may be struggling, but it's much easier for us to help other people than it is to help ourselves. And so that's kind of the catalyst of what we try to do there. You were saying earlier, you wanted kind of like a Cliff's Notes of my story. And so about 13 years ago was my call. And I've talked to enough people that we all have our call that changes us completely. My life was on this trajectory. And as soon as I had that call, it went totally sideways. And when you talk about choice, easy to say, and it took me probably a little over a decade to understand it, is that I am in control of what I choose to medicate with, what I choose to view and how I view it. And I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But I had a little girl that was the same age and size as my son that drowned. And in hindsight, I now know that I had no control over it. Like, I know for a fact she was gone before we got there, but I had even said it in a little documentary video I did for November, was that for the longest time, I thought it was my job to save that little girl. Like, you get trained in the police academy to do certain things. You get trained in the fire department to do certain things. And as a paramedic to do certain things. And when you can't do it, you don't know what to do with yourself. And so regardless of the fact that there was nothing that I could have done to save her, I carried that with me for so long, is that it was my job to save her and I didn't. And so over the course of those next, I would say probably about 9 years, I kind of made every mistake that you could make. I self-medicated. I became an alcoholic, and I think as a first responder, we become functioning alcoholics because you have to be sober to do your job. But if I had any option, it started out with just, oh, this was a bad call, or I'm fighting at home with my wife, or something, just whatever it was. And it transitioned into, oh, it's noon. I went to the gym already, so I can have my first drink to take the edge off. And it just grows into this monster if you don't address your issues. And there's no blueprint. A lot of people come to me and say, how do you get better? How do you do this? How do you do that? It's a lot of work, and good, bad, or ugly. Like, the reward is unbelievably worth it, as opposed to trying to survive. Those of us that are on here that are still using alcohol or something else to medicate, they can attest to it. They don't have to, but they can attest to the fact that in the moment, to numb yourself, to just not feel anything at all, feels fine for the first half hour. But the more your thoughts go dark, when you pass out, when you wake up, you feel 10 times worse, and you just start that process all over again instead of trying to address the issue, which I'm here to tell you, like, it sucks. It's horrible. It's not easy. And it's exhausting, but it is unbelievably worth it. And it literally saved my life. So.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you could start, maybe back up just a little bit. And how were you doing before the call that kind of changed everything? Like, how were you doing with your functioning and your job? And I think we can help kind of take people through, how was I doing before? Then this happened, my call, and then some of the things that happened in the aftermath.
I was very happy-go-lucky. Like, I started trying out for the fire department right after September 11th, kind of for a lot of us older people. That's where
I'm in that category.
That's where kind of things started to change for me, at least. And I was very kind of stuck in a rut, wasn't doing a whole lot with my life. And I realized I wanted to do more. And so the idea of being a firefighter, and especially back then, it was a really, really, really popular thing, and just heroes and all this cool stuff. And that's what I wanted to do. And I loved being on the fire truck. I loved helping people. And it was my calling, you know? And it was a lot of fun. We would talk about it. And again, fun is a weird word for it, but when you have those really bad calls, those car accidents and body parts and stuff like that, like you get excited because you're like, that's what I'm here for. That's what I wanted to see. And that's what I wanted to do. I don't think you realize, especially in the beginning, and that's why it's a hard nut to crack when you go and talk to like paramedic classes or the cadets and stuff like that, is that trying to explain to them, hey, be ready for seeing this stuff. And it's like, okay, because you're excited, you know, and that's how it was for 8 or 9 years. Love jumping on the truck, love going on the calls, and nothing really affected me. And the more people I've spoken to, it's that it's different for everybody. Is that particular call that I went on, I know for a fact now that it affected some people close to the way it affected me. Other people didn't bother them at all because they didn't have kids, because they had different life experiences. One of the huge things I found through rehabilitation and everything is that everybody's story is different. And sometimes, whether it's a police officer, a firefighter, a veteran, if you come up from a hard background, if you had a rough upbringing, rough life, and you already went through a lot of stuff, when you come into these jobs, it's kind of easier. You're like, this is fine. Like I saw this every day. Yeah. My parents are addicts, things like that. And so it's understanding, like, kind of like where you're at. And back to what you were saying, I was happy-go-lucky up until that day. And I remember going on the call that day, and I had just made my food, sat down to eat it. We got the call and we left. And I remember coming back, and it's the first time I felt like I was on a different planet. Like it had been an hour and a half. Everything was different.
Yeah, and I think you hit like a few nails on the head. And as a mental health provider who's worked a very long time with first responders, with military, including combat veterans, I think you're hitting so many nails on the head, which sometimes part of the disconnect with people who want to offer support that maybe aren't in the business or don't have those experiences is they start off thinking everybody's just negatively impacted right from the get-go, like the first accident or the first fire or whatever. And, you know, sometimes fires are fun, right? Or all, like you said, all those things are fun. And so I think that can be one of the things that maybe stops someone from saying something or leaves a bad taste in their mouth. And people just assume, oh, you're a first responder, you must feel awful all the time. And that's not the case. And it can set up, when you do finally hit that call that changes everything, the fall can be that much harder.
Absolutely.
Okay, so talk a little bit more about that. So you're doing you, right? You're what you've done for 8 or 9 years, and then this call comes in.
Call comes in, we experience it, and it's just the strangest thing, because like I said, all of a sudden, it's a fragility. I spent years after that. I remember with my son, like I would just stare at him, and I said it during that TED Talks, is that the first thing I did after the helicopter took off to go to the hospital was I called my mother-in-law at the time and said, I didn't want to hear my son. Let me talk to my son. And she's like, oh, I'm sorry, he's taking a nap. And I said, I don't care. Just put him on the phone. I need to hear him breathe. And up until then, that was trivial. There was like, what for? Like, he's obviously breathing. He's fine, kind of thing. And it was just so interesting because I was hyper vigilant. And I remember the first time we took him to the pool, like I was in the pool, just like staring at him. And I'm looking around at people like, why aren't you all freaking out? Why aren't you all hyper vigilant as well? And it's just because you haven't had those life experiences. And it took me a very long time. Like I did not get past that particular call probably for about a decade. And that's exactly why I try to talk and share my story. Is my prayer is that one person on here listening can say, hey, I'm in the same boat, or you're headed down the same road. Mm-hmm. And if I can help them avoid 1, 2, or 10 things that I've done, that makes it worth it for me. And all I can do in recovery is try to make up for all the mistakes that I've made, which people have a tendency to say, oh, I understand it, or you've been through this and you've been through that, and it's not your fault. And it's like, no, it's certain things were out of my control, but certain things were in my control. I can see that now. Yeah. At the time, I didn't know. But yeah, it was everything changed for me. I was a lot darker person. And I'm going to kind of jump all over the place with it. But one of the hard things is that after that call, I spent almost those whole 10 years waiting for the other shoe to drop with calls. So after the worst one, it was always, when is the next worst one going to come? And it eventually would. And that's part of the problem with our jobs is if you have a profound life-changing call you go on, you already know how that feels. And it's good to prepare yourself for it. I can say I've had way too many kids pass since she did, none of them affected me the way that she did. But you live in this dark space when all you're doing is waiting for the next bad call, and it can go from 1 month after that one, or 6 months, or even a year. But after that year, like you spend a year dreading going to work, you spend a year dreading going on a call because you don't know what's going to happen. And then that next call happens like that. And you're like, oh, of course,
And
like I knew it was going to happen. And it went from it being a year in between to it being 5 seconds in between.
Right.
And it's just, you can't live like that and function like that healthy. Like it's led to divorce for me. It's led to me making all these mistakes because I was in such a dark place. And so I keep going on calls, I keep doing my job. And there were little moments, you know, we have the ability to make a difference in certain situations. But like, I love my job, as I should. And most of us get into these jobs, you don't say, I'm going to be a police officer, so I can really hate my job in 6 months. Because we
Right.
don't get paid that well to to like dread hating or dread coming into work. We
Right.
all started, whether you're a police officer, a firefighter, or a veteran, you generally do these jobs because you want to make a difference and you want to help other people, or you want to help your brothers and sisters. So how do we get to a place where we dread going to work, where we
Right.
hate seeing what we see and stuff like that? You're always going to hate what you see
Right.
when you see something terrible and you see how it affects family members. That's still to this day the hardest thing for me is I can usually process the people that pass away, and I may remember them, but it's the screams, it's the sounds, it's the smells that can still trigger you or can still just remind you, even when you process all these things. Like when I said I don't feel like there's a fix for it,
Right.
which isn't a bad thing either. It's just you learn how to like navigate your journey. Is that when you sit here and say, I spent 3 years after that call saying every day, what do I need to do to get back to the person that I was? And I wanted to be that person. And a counselor finally told me, she's like, you're never going to be the same person.
Right.
You're always going to be different, but that doesn't mean you can't be happy. That doesn't mean you
Right.
can't live a good life.
Right.
And I've mentioned it before, and you've seen the ball in the box when it comes to trauma. Have you heard about
Mhm.
that?
Yeah.
Where it's like your head is a box and the ball is the trauma. And when trauma first happens, it's huge.
Right. Takes up all
And
the
it's
space.
so true. Yeah.
Mhm.
And it's so true. And then as time goes on, even me, gosh, I'm 23 years now total. And I rarely think about the bad calls, just because like unless something huge triggers it. And even when I remember it, I try to process it as best I can, is that ball is really small, but it's very interesting because every now and then it'll still happen. And I'll still have times where I still deal with anxiety to this day. I still have a hard time. I'm super blessed, but I have a hard time getting out of bed some days, and I'm on the right track. And so you're forever changed. I was forever changed for sure. And it's just been my goal to try to get back to as great of a place as I can. And so I hope to do here.
Yeah, and it sounds like, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about this, both directly after the call. Did you have any awareness this one's different, like right away? Like I'm not acting different. I'm not acting the same. I feel different. Like when you made that call to your mother-in-law, were you aware at the time, wow, I'm being really different than I normally am?
I didn't say to myself I was being very different. Everything was different.
Okay.
Yeah. So I just remember, even from that moment when the helicopter took off, like as everything started to get back to normal, we started picking up our gear, is I hear dogs barking. I hear cars driving by, and it's just like, it's a weird sound to me. I'm like, I was like, I don't know if hyper aware is the right way of putting it, but the biggest difference I had is up until that point, I never had a flashback. I never had traumatic memory just pop into my head, an intrusive memory where I just could not get it out. And everything that I did, every time I closed my eyes, all I did was see her. Like I'm talking about it right now.
Mhm.
I see her.
Yeah.
And I didn't like it. I didn't know what to do with it. And so at that time, initially I was drinking NyQuil to go to sleep, not because I was sick, not because I didn't feel good. It's just, that was the only thing I could do to not dream when I went to
To
bed.
turn it off. Yeah.
And so I was doing that, and I thought to myself, well, that's not normal. Like this isn't okay. But the correct answer would have been go talk to somebody, maybe get on a medication to help with your anxiety, your flashbacks, things like that. Instead, I told myself, well, one, I didn't want to be seen as weak, as we talked
Right.
about, which is ridiculous. And we can talk about that in a little bit too. But I didn't want to be seen as weak. I didn't want people to know that I was struggling. And so what's easily available, what's legal
Right.
is alcohol, right? And so it was not nearly as bad then as it became. But that was the start of me drinking. That was the start of me self-medicating. I didn't call it self-medicating at the time,
Mhm.
but every night, I'd have a couple of drinks, take the edge off, whatever it needed to be to take that edge off. It was when I started doing that. And so that was my biggest notice was the flashbacks.
Okay.
And I've had millions since then, but that was the start of it. Because prior to that, nothing.
Okay.
So
And what are the people in your life noticing at this time? What are they noticing and are they communicating with you about it? Are you communicating with them about it?
the most profound thing that was communicated with me was I remember that first week, especially, I was just not there. I was just a zombie. And her and I have talked about it now, and we're actually really close again. But my ex-wife, who I was married to at the time, she's like, you need to be present. Like, you have a wife, you have a 3-year-old child that needs you, and you're not here. And I remember seeing red, and I was like, you have no idea what it's like. And you haven't seen this, and you don't know, and you don't know, and you don't know. And was there a gentler way to say it? Maybe. But at the same time, she was 1,000% right. This was a horrible thing. I should have been allowed to process it, which I did have time. And it didn't mean I had to be that person again. But I never shared with her what I was dealing with. I never shared how hard it was. I just completely changed. Like, she even says to this day, how much she hates the fire department, not the one I work for or anyone in particular, but just because she's known me since high school and she watched me change.
Yeah.
And that's been kind of the hard part about advocating is you got to tell people that do the job, you will change. You are going to see things that are going to change your perspective on life. They're going to make you angrier. They're going to make you sadder. They're going to all the emotions. But if you start planting the seed now to talk about it, if you start understanding that it's okay to not be okay and have these conversations, which I'm actually seeing the change,
Yeah.
you can avoid a lot of that. And back, 13 years ago, it wasn't talked about. It wasn't discussed. And I just didn't know how to deal with it. And I just became a different person. But she specifically told me, you need to be present. And it still took me 3 years past that call for me to be crying in my laundry room out of nowhere. I had no trigger, just crying. And I went out to her and I said, I think I need to talk to somebody. Like, I think I need to go to counseling. And I hate the fact that it took me as long as it did. I'm a gigantic advocate for counseling because even through my journey, had I not had counseling, I don't know if I'd be sitting here today, because you get these counselors that tell you things you don't want to hear. And even that particular call, she made me talk about it from start to finish, from the middle to the end, from the end to the beginning, to the point where it became kind of normal to talk about.
Yeah.
And so, like, none of this is easy to talk about. I don't recommend advocating to anybody that doesn't want to.
Yeah.
And part of my mistake was that I thought, because I would share individually, that I was ready to go public and share my story and share my struggles and things like that. And it's hard doing it on this stage, doing it to like a documentary video, whatever you want to say. If you're not ready for it, I highly don't recommend doing it. But if you're ready to share your story, I think it can be healing. And I just ripped the kind of the Band-Aid off way too soon when I started it. So I think I did it the wrong way, but I also encourage people do it on an individual basis. If you think it's going to help you even more, obviously share your story, because that's been the biggest difference. Is people have changed my life to this day by sharing with me their stories, by telling me their struggles. I'm like, wow, this is exactly how I feel.
It's not just.
And I'm not just up here like everybody's staring at me.
Yeah.
So it's been nice to know you're not alone.
Yeah, I think that's hugely powerful. And even when you know you're not alone, you don't really know it until you hear other people starting to talk about it. And often that comes from sharing your story. So your wife in particular at the time is watching you change,
Oh, yeah.
is watching you. I like how you said it or how she said it. You're not here.
Mhm.
Like, literally the person that they love and know is no longer there.
Mhm.
And so what did you start noticing that finally said, I really need to do something? You said it took a while, and some folks never quite get there, right? They have kind of all these things going on, but they never have that realization of, I need to do something. Can you talk maybe a little bit more about what was it for you that said, you know what, I need to do something? This is, I've known this is not good and I need to do something.
People laugh about it, but it's making every mistake that you can make twice, 3, 4 times. I get grief about it all the time, but it's part of why I'm a stereotypical like first responder. It was being divorced twice.
Okay.
It was going to rehab, all of these things, or finally getting to the point where I knew I needed to go to rehab, but I hurt people unintentionally. I was the person that I became was just this horrible human being. And there's still people to this day that hate me because of my actions. And I'm 100% responsible for them. I picked up the first drink. I made the choices that I made and did the things that I did, whether I spend the rest of my life making up for it or saying that that's not who I am. Like that's my goal now, is to be the real person that I am, not the person that I was to so many people for so long. But as far as just knowing when it was enough, it becomes a cumulative thing. I can't tell you how often I was hungover doing a talk about mental health, or just getting to the point. And one thing I didn't touch on in the first talk, and I'm starting to embrace is the wrong word, but being more open about is the fact that I was I never termed it suicidal because I didn't sit there and say, like, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to get a gun, or I'm going to do that. But I had days where I just didn't want to exist. And especially when I drank, when I got down to that pint, I just didn't want to be here. And I was thinking of all the ways that I couldn't be here. And it took me getting to know 3 widows locally and talking to enough people that was like, this is exactly where you're headed if you don't do something about it. And one of my biggest fears had been, and especially looking back, like I'm still ashamed of it, is I wouldn't drive drunk, because I would say, oh, I'm only gonna get a little half pint because that's all I need today. Because it'd be weird if I was going to get a handle every day, right?
Right.
Being
So-
alcoholic.
So
Right.
but I had my little alcoholic route to go to get the alcohol and make it home. And this was like the safest route for me. And I knew it really well. But countless times, had I been pulled over, I would have absolutely been above the legal limit. And I wouldn't have been able to live with myself if, as a first responder, my job was to help people and I ended up hurting somebody. Like if I took somebody's life, I woke up handcuffed to a hospital bed and I was still here, like I wouldn't have been able to live with myself. And faith is my journey. I don't push it on anybody else, but I know that at a certain point, God kind of told me, look, I think you can be capable of some pretty great things, but I can't keep helping you on this road that you're on. And I needed to make that change. And it's probably the hardest thing I ever had to do, especially since I was like a few years into advocating already. But I had to tell some of my peers at Next Rung, like, I think I need to go to rehab. And it was the funniest thing, because my counselor at the time, when I told her, I was like, hey, I don't think I can. I'd spent years telling her, I want to just get to a point where I can have a couple of drinks with my friends and enjoy alcohol and just have a good time. And she'd just be like, and she wouldn't say anything, right? But the day that I told her I needed to go to rehab, she was like, I think that's a great idea. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
So,
You're like, just like that. Right.
yeah. Well, and that therein lies the problem too, is that we can be told a million times. One of my exes had told me, like, if you're not going to get sober for yourself, get sober for your son, get sober for this and this and this. And it made me so ashamed, because he's 1,000,000% a reason to stop, and I couldn't. And that's why rehab is not for everybody, because some people can just stop. But it broke my heart because it had that big of a hold on me at that point. And you don't see it coming. You don't see, like, you know that after a rough shift, I'm going to have a beer, or I'm having 2 beers, or I'm 3 beers. And a lot of people I've spoken to, it's pretty cool, because they're like, I think I have a problem, and they can back off. Well, I just traveled along this really slow moving train, and I never saw it grow into what it grew into. So.
Yeah, and boy, I think you're really touching on some things, and I see Jeff nodding and stuff too. And I imagine folks listening, I'm thinking about that moment of where you realize, I cannot do this the way I've been doing this. I can't just stop. Or I think that's a big thing that keeps people from speaking up, is almost this, like, the word I'm trying not to use is surrender. Like, I have to surrender to, I can't do this on my own. And I have to be the one that says, I have a problem or I need help, which is so difficult to say. So I'm wondering like how long you chewed on that, or did those thoughts come and then you kind of pushed them away before you finally went and said, I think I need to go to rehab. Like, this is not going to get better the way I'm doing it.
I think I just made the final biggest mistake that I've ever made, and thankfully it wasn't something legal. Thankfully it wasn't something, but it was very much brought me to the lowest point as a human being as far as my actions and things like that. And so it just became a matter of, look, you either stay on this path and you end up getting to a point where you're going to find a way to not be here anymore, or you change everything. Because up to that point, for those, 13 years or 9 years, nothing had worked. Everything ended up back in the same exact spot.
Yeah.
But it was because nothing I was doing was changing. Like I'd have the best intentions, or I'd make the biggest effort, or I could tell you, you're an alcoholic
Right.
because I am too. I'm just not ready to get help.
Right.
But it was a matter of speaking to the founders of Next Rung, and they're helping me to pay to go to treatment. And I'm like, I can't do that. Like, I joined here to help you. I joined here to get other people to come here and follow us and do this and do that. And he's like, Rob, your story was a good story before. Imagine if you actually get the help you need and how much greater your story can be. And it was like, okay, I'm going to go into this saying they saved my life. They changed my life, because they did. Because had I not had, and that's the kicker to this whole conversation, I think, is that I was lucky. And I had done a little bit of the legwork to have these, to be a part of Next Rung, to have Skulls for Hope become what it's becoming. A lot of people don't. People that are listening right now, or people that are struggling on their own, like, when shit hits the fan, you don't have anything. You don't have a counselor. You don't have somebody you can turn to. You don't know who to talk to. You're worried that if you tell a coworker, they're going to think less of you, or they're going to go tell everybody else. Because
Right.
I don't know if it's a popular opinion or not, but I feel like police department, fire department, and military, again, all three of them are very much like a fraternity, or a sorority, or whatever you want to say, where everybody talks about everybody. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody wants the tea. Everybody wants to talk about somebody else. And a lot of the people that speak the loudest are the ones that have their biggest struggles. But if they focus on you,
Right.
then they don't have to worry about theirs. And so I was lucky enough to have a tiny, tiny shaky foundation to start with. And a lot of people don't. And that's what I hope changes today, is we're trying to plant that seed of like, hey, talk to somebody, reach out to Skulls for Hope, reach out to Next Rung, reach out to SCION. Because the really cool thing now is there's a ton of resources available. People just aren't aware of them.
Out of curiosity, this was a kind of conversation that we had before, was we look at ourselves and we're like, we don't need help, but, and we always point out, right, this coworker or this friend, they do. Did you ever see yourself, did anyone ever approach you that way where you were like, well, I don't need the help, but maybe this person or this person? Or do you think vice versa? Like maybe someone said, I don't need help, but I know Rob needs help. Did you ever see any of that?
At the time I didn't, and that was no fault of anybody. There was no blueprint. There was none of this was around.
Right.
I had a lot of people come after the fact and tell me, yeah, dude, I totally could tell. Like, you came into work and you look terrible, or I've watched you for a while and I'm really glad you got that help. And it was like, you can't get mad at somebody for not saying something earlier. When I came back from rehab, my mom was in tears and she's like, I should have known, I should have stepped in, I should have done this. And I'm like, as a parent, I can understand where she's coming from, but I told her very bluntly, I was like, had you come to me and said, Robert, you have a drinking problem, I'd have been like, oh, okay, cool, sorry. And I would have figured out a way to hide it,
To hide it
which
better, right?
as a recovering alcoholic and meeting people on calls or seeing peers, we don't hide it at all. We think
No.
with putting gum in our mouth
Right.
or whatever else that people
Right,
can't
right.
smell it. And it's, I don't know if it's just a super sense now that I'm sober, but it's very easy to tell. And it's funny too, because I think people think because I'm sober now that it makes you like above somebody. And if anything, you still feel 5 steps below and you're more empathetic. You're not sitting there going, well, I don't drink. And it's just like,
Right.
do I miss it? Honestly, yeah. Like, I wish I could have a drink and enjoy myself and laugh when we go out. And I see people like having a blast and letting go. Like, I do miss that a little bit. I don't miss the alcohol. I don't miss the feelings at all. And I know now that it doesn't serve a purpose in my life, but it's just, it's perspective. It's how you're looking at things and what you're choosing to do with what you have. But no, people didn't as much as you would hope.
Right.
It wasn't addressed, but even when I went to rehab, they asked me like, what do they teach about mental health? And now every department talks about mental health. But back then it was a stigma, is you don't talk about it and there's no need for it. It's not a big deal. If you can't do the job, you quit.
Right.
And what's amazing about every department I've seen is that that's a completely flipped on its head now. But at the time, one of the guys in my rehab facility was like, what do they have? Or what did you do? I was like, nothing. Right. But it's also not the department's fault. And kind of like I say, is every talk that I've ever done, when I talk to cadets, when I talk to paramedic students, when I talk to people that are brand new at the job, it's right over your head. And it's supposed to be. Like I can tell you in detail about the last pediatric code I had, and it's not going to hit home because you weren't there and you didn't experience it yourself. And that's okay, but there's nothing we can do in training, I feel. There's nothing you can do in schooling, training, anything that's going to compare to the real life experience. The funny thing has always been is like veterans are very alpha, but every single veteran that I've ever met that has been on deployment, that has seen horrible things, that has been through horrible things, they're the calmest people I know. The ones that haven't been are the loudest speakers, the ones that talk the most about it. And there's no class you can take. There's nothing you can do that's going to prepare you to see those things. So I'm glad we're doing it now, and I'm glad we're planting the seeds. It's just waiting to see what ends up happening.
Right.
And I think that's by far tagging along with that. One of the biggest questions I hear that I'm asked personally, that people are like, hey, who can help us with this, is what should, or any, I don't want to say should, but what are some recommendations you have if someone either sees someone struggling in a way that I think you described it so beautifully, right? When your coworker or your friend is different, just like people were noticing with you, like how might you offer some recommendations on approaching someone? And then if you're the person that people do say, hey, I'm worried about you, can you offer some wisdom on how to receive that as well? So how to give it and receive it if you see something's wrong.
So duty might be a strong word, but I think it's our duty in the leadership position that if you see something, you say something. The perfect example I can have for that is I had the call I was telling you about, the 2-day-old that was in cardiac arrest. After that call was done, one of the individuals that was there was a newer guy, and I could see on his face that he was shaking up. And as we walked out of to the back bay and kind of we're doing our little after the call talk, so you doing all right? He's like, oh yeah, yes sir, I'm fine. And I made the choice to tell him the truth, and I was like, well, good for you. Like, I'm glad, because that, pardon my language, but that call fucked me up. Like, that was a really rough call. And you see his face kind of soften, and he's like, really? And I said, absolutely. Like, anybody that goes on these types of calls and thinks it's not a big deal, it's very weird to me. Like, maybe it's not, and I'm not one to push it, but it affects me still to this day. And he's like, wow, oh, well, yeah, no, it affected me too. He had a few kids. Some of them were close to the same age. And it was just kind of pushing through that barrier just a tiny bit and saying, I'm not okay. And I wasn't lying. I'm not okay. Like, none of those calls are okay. I don't like going to any of them.
Yeah.
But just giving him that window to say that, because I talked to him later about what he saw, because I just saw what I saw. I was doing what I was doing. And to him, he said he showed up and saw me doing CPR on this tiny little thing and jumped in the back of the ambulance, and he had to go in, or the rescue, and he had to go and drive it. And you think, oh, my trauma's not as big as him because I'm not doing this compressions, or I haven't been in the job as long, and I haven't done this and I haven't done that. It's like, no, we're all human.
Right.
It's all hard for us, but the best way I can explain it is, yes, in a leadership position, I think it's our job to check to make sure people underneath us are okay. If you choose not to do that, that's your choice. I also think that if you have that itch in the back of your head, if you just can tell somebody's different, talk to them. Just say, are you okay? And a veteran actually did it to me very recently. He came up to me, and I was having a rough day, but he came up to me at the gym and he's like, hey, Rob, how are you doing? I said, oh, I'm good. I'm good. And he looked at me, he's like, but how's Robert? And I was like, And I had to sit there for
Wow.
a second.
Yeah.
And to me, what wasn't a big deal is me just verbalizing to him, I'm like, okay, so this is what's going on in my life. This is what I'm struggling with right now. And it was the strangest, silliest thing is that I felt so much better. I just was trying not to burden him with
Right.
my trivial stuff because I'm also like, okay, I'm sober now. I have the tools. I'm doing all these things. So I'm not
So
going
I'm
to
good.
bother you. Yeah.
Right,
Well, I'm not going to bother you
Right,
because
right.
I'll eventually get it figured out.
right.
Doesn't mean I still don't want the help. It doesn't mean I
Yeah.
still don't want somebody or to know that somebody cares about me. And so just it's if you have that itch, say something to that person because what we always do is we just assume that they're fine until we find out that they're not fine. People that we lose in this job to things that are outside of the job duties. Majority of the time you can say, oh, I should have seen this, I should have seen that, I should have seen the other. And you still just don't want to say anything. Doesn't mean you have to force somebody into something, but them knowing that you see a change, them knowing that you're going to be there for them. If you feel it once, if you feel it 5 times, just check in on them, constantly check in on them. Because that's the rock and the hard place is if you come into me over and over saying, I know something's wrong and I'm not willing to do anything about it, or I'm not ready to do anything about it, then there's not going to be a change. My biggest regrets prior to going to treatment, I remember talking to my barber of all people, and she was like, I told her how regretful I was, and that if I could go back, that I would just change everything, which most people that have regrets will say. And she said, yeah, but if you hadn't made those mistakes, would you be so resolute to never make them again? And it hit me like a ton of bricks because I'd like to say I would.
Yeah,
But making all the huge mistakes that I've made have led me to being resolute about sobriety, being resolute about all this stuff. And it's still a day-to-day thing. I know in my heart that I'll never drink again. But I also know people that are 10, 15, 20 years into sobriety, and I'm barely in 4, which is huge to me,
it's huge.
but it's not, but it still has to be work. And that's where I think we end up falling off is we say, okay, we're going to get help,
Right.
start counseling, go to counseling. Cool, they fixed me, I'm done.
Right,
And you
I'm done.
leave.
Yeah,
And
Nope.
they teach you in AA is that like they have their strict rules, but the gist of it is that like you stay involved. Is when you stop coming to meetings or you stop going to counseling or you stop saying like, this is what's going on in my life, is when we go back to those old habits, is when we start falling into the same rut because we're not actively working on a recovery. And recovery doesn't have to be from alcoholism. It can just be recovery for your mental health. And
Right,
you stop going to
absolutely.
counseling, don't see a counselor for 6 months. That's fine. But have that context so when shit hits the fan again, you have somebody to go to, and we always say, oh, they don't know what it's like. They're not first responders. They haven't been on the calls we've gone on. You don't have to. Like, yes, to a certain extent, am I going to understand certain things better than you are
Right.
because I've experienced some of the similar things? Absolutely. But one thing I've learned through peer support with Next Rung, you talk to people around the country. Nobody's been on the call that I've been on.
right.
I've never been on the call where this other person's been on. But what is the same is the trauma.
Right.
What's the same is this guy wakes up in the middle of the night doing CPR on his pillow, and he never did that before.
Right,
And it's letting him know he's not alone. It's being able to listen and not one up his story. It's
Right.
saying there are resources out there, but the big thing is his perspective is that, are you really a black cloud? Do you
Right.
really get all the bad calls? Or, and again, it's my own journey, my own faith, but did God or whoever put you in that position because you were the best capable person to handle that call and to be there for those people? Because I think we get away from that, is that this is traumatizing to me. But what about the parents? What about the family members? Like, we have the ability, even if it's quote unquote not your job description, to hold that family member, to tell them it's going to be okay. And we don't always do that because we're trying to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
We're hiding behind that mask and we're like, no. If I let out emotions and I'm there for these people, it's just going to open up the floodgates. And it might, but the level of comfort you can bring will end up bringing you comfort too, so, and same thing with helping each other out, your peers, is me helping you. If I do that, it's not like, cool, like recognize me for doing that,
Right.
but my work in peer support and mental health has been 10 times more rewarding than going on a call has ever been.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said. And I want to be mindful of time. I don't know if there are comments and things in the chat. before I surrender at least my ability to ask questions to you,
Mhm.
I'm wondering what you think would be, what should we say when we occasionally run into those last kind of holdouts of, if you can't do the job, then don't do the job, right? This isn't for the soft, this isn't for the weak. Keep your chin up, put your head down and plow forward. What do you think we can say to help people, both who say that and hear that?
Again, I feel like the people that say if you can't do the job, you need to quit are the ones that struggle the hardest. I've talked to guys in retirement that have been retired for 13 years that still cry every night, and they don't have to. Like, we are changed, we are different, but you don't have to live in this dark, dark place. And some of these people that were my peers in other entities that tell their subordinates that you can't do the job, just quit. They're having the biggest struggles. And to me, I always flip it on its head, is that to me, admitting you're not okay is a strength, not a weakness, because it's much harder to say you're not okay than it is to say, I'm just going to be a part of the pack and I'm going to go out partying all the time and I'm going to pretend like I'm super alpha male, super alpha female and not show anything. But when I go home, I'm going to bawl like a baby, and it shows strength to admit that you're not okay. I feel like it makes you better at your job, whether it's police, fire, or even a veteran, is that the empathy, the sympathy that you have and you're able to give to your peers and you're able to give, especially on our end, to our patients or to the people that you respond to, I think is huge.
Yeah.
Because you're already fighting against the stigma when you show up on a call and you're there to help.
Right.
But people see the uniform, they
Right.
hear the stories, and they
Right.
and I've been there where they treat you like crap, and it's just like, okay, you're treating me like crap, but what's going on in your life?
Right.
And sometimes taking 2 minutes can completely redirect even the call that you're on
Right.
by showing that sympathy and showing that empathy and saying, hey, like, I understand you're mad. What's going on? Oh, my,
Right.
it's a million different things, but I just really feel that when the people realize it's not a weakness to say they're not
Oh, yeah.
okay, when they see it's a strength, and yes, we are in the minority right now to the big, huge machine of police, fire, and EMS, but there's a lot of us and we're growing every day. And I am a testament to like changing your path, being better at saying you're not okay,
Yeah.
and realizing, like I said, is like, you're never going to be 100% fixed, and that's okay too.
Right.
It's my scars that you can't see. They make me who I am today. And I wouldn't be able to sit up here and talk to you and share my story if I hadn't been through it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's just so beautifully said, and a larger message that you don't have to surrender being a human being to do this job and do it well. So thank you for that. And I think there's some stuff in the chat.
Yeah.
Jeff can probably see a little bit better than I can.
So Amanda wrote in, and she said, I want to give a huge thanks to Lieutenant Arrieta. He responded to a bad kid call I took last year and saw that I was struggling. He stayed afterwards to give me advice on how to handle it and checked up on me in the following days. His actions definitely changed the outcome of that incident for me, and I think I'm better off for his presence on that scene. Thank you for being willing to share your story and for looking out for others.
Thank you so much for, Amanda, I know we spoke about that, but thank you. I honestly don't have much else to say, but thank you so much for saying that.
And then Elena, she wrote in, thank you so much for sharing your journey, Rob, great information, and I appreciate the resources you put out there. Definitely resources that I will share with my agencies and others. And then Patricia wrote in, thank you so much for sharing. And Rob, I think kind of just going back to Amanda and your comment, Amanda, I think like you said, as we started SCION and as you started like Schools for Hope and starting all these storytelling and basically being able to release the stigma, I think like what Amanda just did, right? What Amanda just did is why we do what we do, why we're here sharing our stories. Because one person will hear that story and it will change the outcome for them. And it's the ripple effect.
Yeah. And
slowly and surely that ripple will continue to go across the pond, across the lake or whatever. But that's why we do what we do. And I appreciate you coming in and sharing your story.
Thank you.
Tim stated, he said, thank you for sharing your struggle and your journey. You were so accurate, reflecting that it takes the strongest people to acknowledge that they are not okay and need some help. Your resource offerings are greatly appreciated as well. And thank you for everything.
Absolutely. And just to reiterate, like, all of us got in this job. Every single one of us got in this job to help other people, to help strangers. So maybe we think about it in a different perspective of, okay, these aren't strangers. These are my brothers. These are my sisters. These are people I care about. And yeah, they may look at me a certain way, but again, I would say 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, the people that push back on you and say, I'm fine, leave me alone, or you're just weak, are the people that are at the worst part of their struggle, and they're just throwing up that wall. So if you see something, say something, and just remember, we got in these careers to help people. So why aren't we helping ourselves?
Because we don't need help.
Yeah, I know.
It is very true, very true. And Andrea just wrote in, she said, thank you for sharing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
awesome. Awesome.
Oh, thank you guys for having me. Every time I kind of feel like, man, people aren't gonna care, and I'm always significantly surprised. So
Hugely impactful, and there's just no substitute for this, right? Of sharing with each other, having that contact, and there's just no substitute for it. So thank you. It's only possible when people are willing to do it. So thank you.
absolutely, always help.
Before we log off, there's gonna be a survey that gets sent in or sent into the chat. If you guys will take it, fill it out. Also up on the screen now, as you can see, are other resources, the suicide prevention lifeline, the veteran crisis line, COP line, New Mexico First Responder Support Line, and NAMI. There's also peer support. You guys can always reach out to both agencies, peer support, and also national peer supports. We are always available. I don't know if Rob will do it, so I'm gonna throw in a plug for him and for Skulls for Hope. He has a bracelet on. I actually bought a bracelet soon after he had presented the first time. But you can buy a bracelet for Skulls for Hope. It has a little skull on it and then just a bunch of glass beads. But it helps fund that nonprofit. So I would definitely do that. There's also t-shirts and other great things like that. But it is there, and I think Rob's too humble to mention it, so I'm gonna do it for him. But it is out there, and there, I think there was one last one, and it said, your transparency helps me be empathetic to the struggles of others and encourages me to pursuing being a chaplain, and thank you.
Absolutely.
Nice.
And on the bracelet note, I never wanted to feel like a commercial or something like, oh, I led up to this to do this. But one of the things about the bracelets and what it became is Skulls for Hope is a community. It doesn't belong to me. It's not my nonprofit. It's this community that we're building, and to start the conversation it's a fidget spinner like what he's doing right now. And what the main thing about it is, none of us ask for help. When we're in our worst crisis, myself included, I have the hardest time reaching out and saying, hey, I need help with something. What the bracelets are supposed to do is they're to remind you that you're not alone. When you're in crisis, when you're sitting in the corner, not being able to talk about what's going on, or you're crying alone to yourself and you're angry at yourself for crying, like you're reminded that there are other people out there that were in the exact same bracelet, going through the exact same struggles. I touched on it, I think, the first time I came here, but the skull represents, in the Tibetan culture, it represents the impermanence of life, that everything lives, dies, and you have to live every day to its fullest. So that's why there's a skull on everyone, but it's just that reminder, that little centering thing that you have, that if you're in crisis, you know you're not alone. And we say it all the time, we show all the resources, but when you're in the middle of that crisis, having something concrete to reflect on and to touch is huge for a lot of us.
Absolutely. Okay,
So,
and
well, with that, we appreciate it, Rob. Thank you again. We will be back in April. I don't remember the exact date, but we will be back in April. And we will see you guys next month. Thank you so much.